Thank you very much for the invitation. It's rare that you look at a program and you say, you know, any one of these papers would be fascinating to listen to. And I'm likely to learn a lot from all of them, so I thank you very much for the invitation at the CDE. This is a paper joint with Felipe Valencia, who is my 1 degree of separation with Brown. It seems you need some connection there. And I want to start with a historical mystery. Since it's early in the morning, really, if you just look at the first 2 graphs, you can ignore the rest of the presentation. Because basically, you get all the intuition. So there's a long debate in development economics, to start with the policy element first, about whether what you produce matters for growth. And I just want to take a case of a very homogeneous product that hasn't changed much in composition at all in about 13.5 billion years, okay? Just after the Big Bang, okay? So this is a product that we can control for a lot of stuff with. But so here's Chile, which is the world leader in production of copper in 1870. It had about 40% of the market. And yet, as it approached 1900, it steadily lost market share. And you could actually see in absolute terms its production was falling. And the Association of Copper Producers at the time basically said, industry is done. Okay? This is no longer going to be a locomotor of growth for Chile. And yet, somehow, after 1910, we see a dramatic increase in production going forward, and they recover about half of their world market share. So what's going on? Clearly, the development impact of copper is changing somewhere around the turn of the century. So this is a little dense graph, but what's going on here in 1905 is the entrance of foreign mining companies and the introduction of new techniques, new techniques of processing copper, Bessemer process, new advances in metallurgy, new advances in chemistry. You can see this is the British coming in, but this is going to be a ratio that I'm going to talk a lot. This is the number of foreign engineers per 100,000 male workers. So it's a measure of the density of engineers. And you can see this number, pay a little attention, not too much, but 70 is where it reaches, and we're going to come back to that number in a second. And it's happening, so almost a doubling right after the American companies come in. Vast influx of foreign engineers. Okay. So they come in, and the industry takes off. It's the application of these new technologies to the same 13.5 billion year old product that is changing the impact of this product on development. What's happening here, and this is foreshadowing where I'm going to go, part of the reason Chile is losing its market share here is precisely the introduction of new technologies by the British and the Germans to the Rio Tinto mine in Spain, which is a 1,000-year-old mine, but the Spanish hadn't really upgraded in about 500 years. It's purchased by the British, and within 15 years, they became the dominant producers in the world, and they're who is killing the Chileans. So the story of copper from mid-19th century and going forward is one of technological adoption and innovation. That is the story. And when we talk about does what you produce matter for development, we have to ask ourselves, as a country, am I going to be here in producing microchips, or am I going to be here when I'm producing microchips, or whatever it is? And I want to just leave with you, before we get to the bulk of the paper, that I really think it's how you produce stuff rather than what you produce that for development is the key question. Okay, so here's a second graph, and then you can go to sleep. So this is what we've done here is for a bunch of different countries in the Western Hemisphere, we've calculated a density of engineers. How do we do this? Most of this is by going into looking at records of universities, looking at university graduates, discounting, summing them up over time, discounting by mortality, stuff like that, to come up with a stock of engineers in 1900, and then we divide by 100K male workers. What are we capturing here? Well, obviously, on the one hand, we're capturing number of engineers, okay, people who can do stuff, do engineering things. But we're also focusing on domestic production, okay? And why are we doing that? Because we want to look at the capacity to train, the capacity perhaps to do research and development, and not just, can I import a bunch of foreigners to do my mines? We're trying to get at something else. Also, we know from Schleifer and company that sometimes engineers use a proxy for entrepreneurs. We're going to talk about how it's worth breaking that apart a little bit, but at least we can talk about technologically savvy entrepreneurs, people who have energy but also who can identify new technological opportunities. And this could also be a proxy for the broader issues of, do you have a national innovation system, scientists, blah, 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 that talk to each other, that are internationally linked, all that sorts of things. But so the first thing to note is, actually the first thing to note is there's a fair amount of variance here. In the sense the US North is about 160. And Argentina, which is not too much poorer, here we have GDP per capita 1900, not too much poorer, is about an eighth of that, maybe about a tenth of that. Okay? And in fact, if we just shoot up here, we see that a bunch of countries at the same level of development at that point, or GDP per capita as Madison measures it, with very different levels of density of engineering. Sweden is a very interesting case because both Sweden and Denmark are peripheral cases, right? These are peripheral economies. These are not the people you think of today. Sweden was called the impoverished sophisticate, relatively low GDP, with way too many engineers. They all came to the United States and invented things like safety matches and ball bearings, which we think are American inventions, but in fact, they are Swedish imports. But in any case, clearly, there are different ways of having reached this level of GDP, and having a lot of engineers characterizes some later very successful countries. But the other thing to note that's interesting is that all of my countries in Latin America are really low. And when I say low, this is our estimate for the United States South in 1900, which was not a technological dynamo. So we're talking that Chile had roughly a third of the engineers of the US South. Okay, that is saying something. Okay, and when we come back to thinking in the long run, we'll come back to that. But the third thing I want to point out on this graph, and then you can go to sleep, Portugal and Spain are in the same wicket. Okay, so it may be that the innovative apple doesn't fall so far from the parental tree, the colonial tree. And we'll come back to that at the end. Just to make it even more dramatic, these are estimates by Ahlstrom, which he asserts are completely comparable to those for Sweden, which we redid ourselves using his data. But it suggests that Germany and France were, in fact, way in the forefront at this time, and just further dwarfs. I mean, that's 260 versus, Ecuador is 0. Just another quick picture, because it wasn't just Chile that lost mining to the United States at this point. Mexico also had all these closed mines, which the Americans bought. They built smelters and the like in Monterrey, and they dominated. If you look at the census statistics, it's about 95% ownership by Americans or British in 1900 of the mining operations. And mining was the most technologically advanced sector at the time. So next time you have a resource curse because there's no technological advance possible, it wasn't the case in 1900. But you see here that basically all of Mexico had a level of engineering density more or less at the level of Alabama in 1900. Okay, so quickly, what are we trying to do here? Well, there's obviously a very large theoretical literature stressing the importance of human capital for growth. But what flavor of human capital, right? Literacy, well, if all of Chile had a 7th grade education, would that have changed the scenario? Probably not. It's just not enough. But we have other kinds of capital you can accumulate. There's learning by doing, which we know that literature. Baumol and Murphy et al. Have stressed entrepreneurship, and we'll come back to that. Mokyr, among others, have stressed trained engineers, capable mechanics, and the like. And then this kind of scientific institutional capacity for research and development, which is covered by a lot of people. Our measure is trying to get at this stuff. It's imperfect, but that's what we're trying to get at. Now, there are a couple of relevant mechanisms that, for me, these have been very useful to think about. And coincidentally, they have a brown focus. So it feels a bit incestuous. But for instance, Aguillon and Howitt both have very nice models, which is basically saying, look, as the technological frontier moves, you have to improve the quality of your human capital, keep up. You have to maintain your frontier-adjusted level of human capital, and if you don't, you are likely to slip out of whatever equilibrium you're in. And Howitt and Meyer-Folks complicate the model a little bit, they have educational efficiency. The production of engineers, in our case, is a function of your distance from the frontier. So it becomes harder to produce engineers the further you are from the frontier. And then they also add in the second industrial revolution, the arrival of new technologies, novel knowledge production. And they come up with 3 equilibria, which are what I walk around with right now, actually, at the World Bank. One is a stagnation equilibrium. This is where you cannot muster the technological capacity to adopt new technologies. This is Chile in 1870, okay? It's losing it. It's Mexico in 1870. They're losing it, okay? Then there's an adoption equilibrium, which is, I think, probably where Chile is right now with Codelco. It's a very well-run international copper company. It's not, it's not making major technological advances, but it's certainly keeping up, and you're not going to get all the quasi-rents of inventing stuff, but you grow at the same rate of growth as the frontier dudes. And then there are the innovators, okay? And these are the guys who actually are generating the new technologies which you're applying. So this is Mr. Bessemer and company. But it's also very interesting because Gavin Wright says, and this gets back to, does what you export matter, that precisely the United States at this period was using copper to lever the construction of a knowledge network, right? So all these universities like Berkeley and the Columbia School of Mines and the Colorado School of Mines, all these are coming up right now to serve the mining industry, and they're becoming experts in metallurgy, they're becoming experts in chemistry, and this is laying the foundation for the subsequent development of the United States, okay? So we have all evidence of all 3 equilibria for copper, okay? And I would say, we would argue that it's not just technology per se, but it's also going to kick in for entrepreneurship. That's to say, there's a frontier-adjusted level of entrepreneurial ability as well that matters for instance, how many engineers you're going to hire. I'm not going to go into this, but simply to highlight that there is a paper that actually breaks apart the sort of scientific and the entrepreneurial capital. I don't know if these guys spent any time at Brown, huh? Ding, 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 ding. Anyway. They also come up with multiple equilibria, whereas if you don't have enough engineers and scientific folks at time 0, then you're not going to have enough use for the rate of return to education in your society is not going to be high enough for people to invest in human capital, and you're going to be stuck in what they call a development trap. So again, you can get multiple equilibria out of that. So empirical documentation is difficult. So tertiary, there are a bunch of people who have been trying to demonstrate that tertiary education matters. Again, Murphy et al. Use engineers as a proxy for entrepreneurship, and they show that lawyers are bad. Waldinger shows that the Nazi dismissals of scientists led to a permanent decrease in growth, so that suggests that this level of higher level human capital is important. Voigtlander, and I don't know how to pronounce it. That's right. Anyway. These guys show that, and it's a fun paper, but the more scripture is the Encyclopédie, which I guess is French, which is, I think, capturing higher order human capital in a broader sort of scientific, higher order human capital environment, grew faster after the dawn of industrial revolution. But there's really no historical data on engineering or overall innovative capacity, and that's where we're trying to plug in here. Skip this. Oops. Oops. Right. Okay, so some suggestive empirics. Okay, so just to see whether our cross-sectional, those 11 observations that you observed for the hemisphere have any sort of predictive power over income today, what we've done here is, because we have some variables which we observe at the subnational level and we have income at the subnational level, we're going to run this thing at a subnational level, fully acknowledging that this thing is aggregate for each country. We're going to cluster by country, and then we're going to bootstrap it because we only have 11 clusters. So I think we're decent on this. And what comes out is, this is multiplied by 1,000, but what comes out is that engineering is correlated with present income today. If we put in population density, why would we care about that? Well, we often find engineers in Boston. And so we want to be sure that we're not like picking up just agglomeration externalities per se. So we put that in and it survives. Railroads hired a lot of engineers, okay? So are we picking up improved transportation, or are we picking up somehow engineers per se? We pop in railroads, it survives. Literacy, blows it apart, but later we'll be able to separate those apart. We just don't have enough degrees of freedom to separate them. And you plug them all together, it survives, with the exception of literacy. And this column, I mistook, but what I had done is I dropped Canada and the United States, because obviously there's a huge amount of variance coming from just particularly the United States at this point. If you drop that, we still actually get it significant, but obviously these two columns are the same, so that's not showing it. But you'll have to trust me for now that even if we drop the United States and Canada, something comes out in engineering as significant. Now we have 6 countries for which we've managed to develop subnational measures of engineering that we can match to our levels of present GDP. Okay, so we're going to look at the within variation here. And some deal with clustering and bootstrapping. So engineering just on its own emerges significantly, although with a much smaller coefficient. Population density, again, doesn't kill it. Literacy here doesn't kill it, although it does reduce its impact. So we are conflating those two things here. So we seem to be able to identify that there's some independent impact of higher order human capital from literacy. These two institutions, variables by Brun and Gallego, don't enter here. We can talk about later, if there's time, why that might be. We pile the whole thing together, and it's surviving. Okay? So you want to say, yeah, you got 166 observations, 6 countries. You know, I'm not going to bet my entire development strategy on this. Fine. Okay? But what we've got here is the first set of engineering data from an earlier period of time, and it's suggestive that it's kind of connected. So, and for the United States regressions, so now we're really getting hallucinatory. We've got 51 observations. But just taking the US, we have a little bit more. We can put in things like lawyers and mining and slavery and things like that. And again, engineering will stay significant across the period. I want to highlight something here, which is slavery, if I drop engineering, is significant. Slavery turns out to be negatively correlated with US development. But if I put in engineers, the slavery variable disappears. So there's another possible channel somehow there that Gave-and-Wright actually broadly develops, which is the lack of investment in higher order human capital across that period. So again, 51 observations. Maybe you don't want to bet your entire development strategy on that. Nonetheless, within the United States, it seems like controlling for things like railroads and lawyers, and which are capturing other higher order human capital, that something is surviving here that is particularly captured by our engineering variable. You could say, okay, but aren't there more engineers in areas that are already growing well? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. And so we steal Moretti's instrument, which was the Morrill Land Grant Act, which was a grant that came after 1862 to endow many universities which you've heard of: Dartmouth, Cornell, Columbia School of Mines, Worcester Polytechnic, University of Illinois, where I spent my time, and Wisconsin, Michigan, I think even Berkeley. And these are supply-driven, to this effect. Okay, so it's particularly in the South, you're coming up with a lot of people after the war saying, yeah, we need a university here. But it's not like there was already a thriving metropolis that was attracting engineers. It was more supply-driven. Now, yesterday someone made a comment about, okay, Ivy with 51 observations. I want to continue that discussion with whoever was having it. But for now, you're going to have to just accept these results. But again, engineering survives in our imperfect IV world. Inclusion of population density, inclusion of literacy, inclusion of lawyers who are negative, but not significantly so. Okay, so just a couple of historical case studies and mechanisms on why this is important. First is, I'll just steal from Gave-and-Wright directly in the American South. He has a very nice quote where he says, Andrew Carnegie's laughing at the Birmingham steel people. It's like, you have all the elements, but you cannot make steel, okay? They're trying to do it. They have all the stuff. They can't do it. And the reason, he says, it's early industrialization is a matter of learning in the broadest sense of that term, in management, in technology, in marketing, and learning on the part of the labor force. And this is primo. This is, okay, think of what was going on in Chile. We'll come back to that. So basically, he's arguing the reason that Birmingham is having such a hard time getting liftoff is an absence of this more sophisticated human capital, measured in terms of marketing, in terms of management, in terms of technology. And he compares it with the Japanese. And the Meiji took the same technology in textiles that was exported to the South, brought it to Japan, and within a generation, they're making their own looms, and they're dominating the world in textiles. This is a story we know. Now, so Chile had a retrocession in mining. This is what we were discussing. Chile and Mexico is exactly. And what do contemporaries say about why the Americans took over the mining industry? It's like, well, they say, they acknowledge this. Mining was as technologically demanding as any, it's the most complicated manufacturing industry at the time. But we had an extraordinary economic ineptitude in the national population, the consequence of an education completely inadequate to meet the demands of contemporary life. And that's one of their most famous historians. This guy's less, but he discusses that the work of mining was not very systematic and the receipt of industrial innovations from abroad was slow and without visible influence. How could it not be? You had a density of 10. Okay? Keep in mind that when the United States came in and took over, foreign entrepreneurs gave us a ratio of 70. Foreign entrepreneurs, foreign engineers. And then this is very interesting too, when we think of that framework of multiple equilibria, right? That not only did they slip out, if you will, of an adoption equilibria, but they had a chance of staying in the game had they upgraded their human capital. And they'd maintained their frontier-adjusted human capital. And Pinto Santa Cruz, which is their second most famous historian, said, look, we failed to take advantage of the opportunities for learning by doing and involve the innovative capacity required to confront the technological revolution of mining. Okay, it's all here. They don't say imperialism. They don't say they had more money than we do, because they all emphatically decide, we had lots of money, we just wasted it. Okay? It's about technology, and the way they phrase it is, we worry that Chileans were unfit for the modern era. And they get into all sorts of things, indigenous blood, all sorts of stories about why they were unfit for the modern era. But the bottom line is they lacked those very things that Gavin Wright was talking about. Brazil is another interesting case. They made iron for a long time on the different fazendas, and they had a textile industry in Minas Gerais, which emerged by itself. But both got killed, okay? And Birchall documents why. And again, it's exactly the existing informal and spontaneous technological innovative system was not developed enough to take the process of technological assimilation farther in the direction of a profound modification of existing foreign technologies. They didn't have the capacity to adopt new technologies and implement. Okay? They lost the textile industry. They almost lost the iron industry. You're importing iron from Britain to the hinterland of Brazil, and you can't compete. Okay, so mechanisms of influence, just is our R&D, our engineering numbers at all correlated with anything that we think affects growth today? And so we have inputs. This is research and development expenditures as a share of GDP. Firm innovative capacity is measured by, I think, the World Economic Forum. I have to check that reference. Modern management, this is Nick Bloom and John Van Rienen's numbers. And outputs, I have numbers, patents per person, technological adoption, also World Economic Forum, I guess. And the correlation is pretty high. Right? This is all my sample, including Denmark and Sweden, and this is just a new world, which is the sample I'm working with. Okay, so there's something there. If you don't fully buy my 51 observations or 36 observations for the United States, in the stories and maybe here, there's something to pay attention to. So how am I in time? Oh, good. Okay, so how do we wind up here? So we all know, I mean, all the things we've been discussing the last couple, the last day, about what may affect growth. If this is an important channel of growth, it all applies here, right? So, for instance, does pre-colonial population density lead to exclusionary institutions that might therefore lead to lower levels of innovation or entrepreneurship? Fair question. Slavery in its early institutions, another proxy for institutions. Do those sorts of things, which are kind of more local, matter to the story we're getting? We have geographical factors, which David talked a lot about last night, and I think we stole some of his, particularly the agricultural one. And then we have a whole bunch of stuff, I'll call them loosely cultural traits, but we know what we're talking about. Here's the genetic, blah, blah. And some, again, done by Enrico, some by Dr. Q. But all these are suggested that maybe it's not so much where these genes are landing as the fact that you are a certain degree of distance from the folks who in Manchester at the time. So let's just look at the United States for an instant. So we have this pre-colonial density measure, which is the density of Indians in 1500. And so the dependent variable is the log of our engineering density variable. So that winds up being significant and positive. And that kind of works for me because in an earlier paper with Felipe, we show that if you had a lot of high Eden density in 1500, you're likely to have a lot of population density today. So if you have a lot of population density and engineers tend to hang together, then it could make sense that we have this kind of agglomeration story. The US South is very bad to be in the South from a point of view of your density of engineers. And that seems to be related to slavery. And not so much to these other institutional variables, we're trying to capture those, but slavery seems to be somehow correlated with that. Then we have David's measure of the Ramankoti. I heard how you pronounced it last night, but I forgot. So cultivable land, river density, temperature, rainfall, distance to the coast, ruggedness, malaria. Many in this room have contributed to the construction of those variables. And we find that ruggedness somehow matters positively, and maybe that's because like the Midwest didn't have too much going on, or the South didn't have too much going on, and it's not so rugged. Rainfall, turns out people don't like to be in wet areas. River density, I think this largely has to do with most of the river density is happening in the Mississippi Delta. And there just wasn't too much going on in Mississippi. So we put it all together, and river density kind of goes away when you put in the southern variables. So I kind of think that's what's going on there. But the important thing is that slavery holds on there. We lose pre-colonial density, but there seems to be some story about whatever was going on with slavery being bad for engineers, and a couple things like distance to the coast, which again is consistent with where we were going, and malaria is bad. And rainfall continues to be kind of bad. So there's kind of a mix of sort of institutional things and some geographical things which seem to matter for the United States. Again, we've got 37 observations and about 15 variables. So yeah, can't get too excited. So here's our 6-country panel. We lose pre-colonial density. Maybe that's related to the Glaser thing that you can have agglomerations, but if there's not a lot of human capital, then you kind of lose any point. If there aren't a lot of other engineers there, then why would you hang out in the city? We don't get much out of the institutional variables, so the bad institutions have a negative impact. Spanish colony is what I want to focus on in the next 5 minutes. And that survives. I'm going to divide it apart. Obviously, California was a Spanish colony, although not as profoundly as colonized as long as, for instance, Mexico. But so if we break those apart, it turns out that California has a positive effect of Spanish colonization, but the colonization as a core variable has a negative impact. And I'm not going to go through these right now, but because I'm running out of time, and I do want to talk about these other things. Why should it matter that I was a Spanish protectorate, whatever? First of all, they have a weak scientific tradition. I showed you at the beginning the number of engineers in Portugal and Spain is as bad as Latin America, okay? Literacy in Spain and Portugal at this time in 1900 is below that of recently freed American slaves, okay? We're talking deeply uneducated people. Weak entrepreneurship. Okay, this is key because who's hiring these entrepreneurs? I mean, these engineers, sorry. It's like you just build engineers and then they don't have a job. There's a cultural story that can be told, right? There's any book on Latin America will say they got the Spanish inheritance, they don't like to do applied work. We had the Sexto Partidos, which came from the Code of Justinian from Rome, which warns against the defilement in commerce, and this was part of the ruling legal structure in Latin America. So you have a direct link to Rome, if you want some persistence, yeah, I think you're still suffering. And you know, exclusionary institutions, I think they had them in Spain. When you have these really low levels of literacy, it's suggested that someone's not spending money the way the Swedes or the Finns were. So there's something to this. If you don't have many educated people, then you're not going to have a lot of sophisticated entrepreneurs who can do stuff. But what's very interesting is you find the exact same things going on in Spain as you find in Latin America, namely that they lose the Rio Tinto mine. The same thing, and the historians tell the same story, which is the entrepreneurs didn't have the technological capacity to manage technological upgrading of that. Same story, highly suggestive that there's some correlation between your home colony, your colonial master, and your outcome. And in addition, you throw on the fact that even if you were a really aggressive entrepreneur in Latin America, you had to trade not with Manchester, you had to trade with Cadiz, which is a backwater in a country that was not in the center of the Industrial Revolution, and you had to do it through Spanish intermediaries, which means you didn't even get to go to Cadiz, okay? So you are so far, you want to talk about barriers to technological transmission, this is what's going on. The Brazilians didn't even allow you to do manufacturing. Lots of things are working against having entrepreneurs who are worth anything. So, I know I'm going to run out of time, but I want you to have this table. Do we have any evidence that, in fact, entrepreneurship was a bit stunted in Latin America? And what we've put together here is, from a bunch of different sources, the share of decent industries, okay, we're not talking micro firms, that were owned by immigrants, that's this column, owned and managed by immigrants, the share of the population that was in immigrants, and we take male immigrants, we assume that all immigrants are male, which is excessive, but, and we assume that most entrepreneurs are male, which was the case. And this gives us a feeling for how much the comparative advantage of migrants relative to local folks in terms of entrepreneurship. And what's striking is that in Argentina and in Sao Paulo, which is a key industrial area, and Chile, Barranquilla and Santander in Colombia, in Mexico, you've got 50% or above of serious industries being established by foreigners, okay? And the representation in the population, sometimes it's only 30% more, 50% more. Sometimes it's 12 times as much as you'd expect, or in the case of Mexico, 25 times. So there's something going on there that immigrants can come in and do stuff that locals were not doing it. Is it the business climate? I'm not really sure why a Syrian tailor comes in and suddenly has a different business climate than a local. Is it property rights? I'm not sure if that same Syrian tailor is going to have different property rights than locals. And those are things that I'm putting question marks there because you may have a different view on that, and I'm interested in hearing it. But the bottom line is there is something going on that most industrialization, in particular the big countries like Argentina and Brazil and Mexico, is being done by foreigners, which suggests that there's something missing. The two cases that I want to look at quickly, I have 2 minutes, 1 minute, 0 minutes. 2. Good, perfect. So Chile, 70%. That's a whopper. We want to understand that one. And then the other one that's interesting is Antioquia, which is a very isolated part of Colombia, where only 5% of the industrialization was done by foreigners, and it's, actually they underperformed the foreigners. Okay, so this is a very interesting case. So there's kind of three roads, which are going back to our original sort of conceptual framework. Did you accumulate the entrepreneurial and engineering capacity? And these matter, they're different at this point, at the time you needed it. And in Chile, they didn't either. Okay, they lost their minds, but we'll come back to that. Antioquia did the entrepreneurship, but without the technical capacity, and that hurt them. And the US did both. So quickly, Chile, very interesting thing for the culturalists among us, because yes, we know that immigrants are dominating it, but the contemporaries are not saying you were a bunch of losers. They say, we used to be great. What happened? We used to get out of bed. What happened? So these books all telling about how we're all the Spanish Roman descendants and we hate to get our fingers dirty. It's like, no, we dominated textile, we dominated nitrates, we dominated wheat, we dominated copper, and the supply response when prices moved in the right direction for these things was very impressive. So the Chileans had something, but the problem is what they had was a kind of old style entrepreneurship, which is like strike it rich, not this kind of long horizon that you need for mining, for instance. I'm going to build up human capital, I'm going to hire engineers, take a 15-year, get the Germans to finance the thing. They didn't have that. And not only that, there's a surprising ignorance of established merchants' techniques. And so we're talking letters of exchange, double entry bookkeeping, lack of basic theoretical knowledge of credit, simple and compound interest. In 1830, the principal newspaper was explaining this. Here's what compound interest is. For Chileans. So they were really behind the curve. So you could argue this is exactly an inadequate diffusion of managerial technique, and they slipped as the frontier moved in terms of what kind of entrepreneurial skills you need. The Chileans didn't keep up, and they lost it. And Pinto Santa Cruz is the second most important historian, argues, we had an opportunity in the nitrate mines. We could have learned all this stuff. We could have, and we didn't. We lived off the rents. Antioquia, Colombia. This is a very interesting case. These guys, who remember, are way overrepresented in the locals in industrialization, and they're like one of Hirschman's 3 poles of development. They're so famous that they searched for all sorts of interesting stories about why these paisas, as they're called, did so well. And so the Jews were escaping the Inquisition in Cartagena, and so they moved up to the mountains where it was more rugged. Or there was a mix of Basque and Caucasian Indians. Not defined what a Caucasian Indian is, but fine. Anyway, all these stories that are floating around, but I think the recent literature is that when the Spanish left, these guys took over the gold production from extraction to marketing in London. So all the transfer of knowledge, they became much closer to the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And then they said, hey, they're producing all this stuff in Manchester, we can do that in Colombia with our closed market. And they moved into coffee and manufacturers. But they didn't develop a technical capacity. And I just quickly want to show you this graph, and I will stop, Jerry, I promise. So here's engineering density, here's a time series. Engineering density versus output per worker for New York, where I have good numbers on engineers, and Antioquia, where I have good numbers on engineers and a good story. So here's output per capita in New York. Here's output per capita in Antioquia. And you see they're lagged about 100 years. Okay? But what's interesting to me is that the density of engineers in Antioquia reaches Denmark, Sweden, the United States in 1900, or New York in 1880, in about 1990. Okay? So it's not, what's going on here is plug and play industrialization. Okay? You're just buying machinery from abroad, and you're producing from the local market, and you erect big tariffs, but you're not developing any technological capacity, any capacity to move beyond. Even, you're probably barely in an adoption equilibrium, you're just buying stuff off the shelf. And I think, when we think about, and here I'll stop, when we think about, well, if Gabe Wright is so right that it was so hard for the South to industrialize with 60 engineers per 100,000 male workers, how did Latin America do it with 15 or 20? The answer is they didn't. Okay? It's all plug and play industrialization, and the way they defended all that into the 50s and 60s was just very, very high rates of tariffs. So they managed to have something that looks like industrialization and growth, but it was actually they did not develop the comparable innovative capacity to make this more dynamic. So again, to where I started, is it what you produce or how you're producing it? I would say that Latin America missed an opportunity to really use industrialization to lever higher innovative capacity. They didn't. That's why you all have Samsung phones and you don't have a Mexican phone. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I ran over.
Okay, we have a few minutes for short questions, and I understand that Bill will actually entertain questions from people, even if they don't have a link to Brown.
Especially.
Bill, so two quick questions. So one is, the first graph you showed in the Chilean case study, both suggest that it's not just the number of engineers, but it may be some sort of interaction between engineering, human capital, and some like managerial human capital,
yes.
Something like that.
Yes.
And so just a question to ask you to comment on what could be an important interaction. There are also examples from like 19th century China where there's training in engineering beginning in the second half of the 19th century. There's an attempt to develop like a modern shipyard by bringing in trained engineers. It doesn't work out all that well, in part because people discuss sort of managerial shortcomings, and so it seems like
perfect.
Sorry, not in that first in the graph with the yeah, exactly. So it seems like engineers are climbing, but there is no takeoff in mining. But then there is perhaps an interaction with engineers climbing post foreign firm coming in.
So they move together, okay? You're not going to build an enterprise employing a lot of engineers if you're not a good entrepreneur, right? So they got to go together. But what I guess I wanted to show with the Antiochian case is it's possible to develop a more sophisticated entrepreneurial capacity, but then kind of subcontract all the technological stuff out to the foreigners, which is what they did. And then when the time came to actually compete with the Asians in the 70s, they got their butts kicked because they didn't have any resources. Oh, we'll tweak it this way. No, they couldn't do it. So I totally agree. So I think you'll give me the China reference.
I'll give you China.
Hi.
So another story that comes to mind with the same picture is this Goodman leapfrogging story. So you could imagine that in Chile, wages are very low. So when the new technologies come up, they're still competitive because their wages are so low, and maybe copper is closer to that. or not as deep in the ground. But then as the new technologies become better and Chile continues to produce just using labor, eventually they're falling behind extremely and they're not competitive anymore. And then it's too late to move on by themselves.
Should be consistent, right? Or
No, it's consistent, but it might be an explanation why engineering does not evolve out of itself, because it doesn't make sense if you're still competitive with the old technology.
right. I think.
Then the foreigners eventually have to come in and give them that.
Right, and I also think it's a problem, and this is a different angle on the typical rent-seeking story. It's a problem if you do have an international stock of engineers that you can employ. Because you say, well, we could do the really hard work of setting up a university and trying to convince our kids, who all want to be lawyers, that they should really be in the sciences. Or we could just basically say, look, we'll take 50% of the copper rents and Anaconda just manage the whole deal. And they went for the second. Yes, you have the story you're telling, but also just the availability of the stock of expertise abroad matters too. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? I mean, I believe the story, and I think everyone should found an engineering school. But for argument's sake, I mean, you could say, well, engineers are some factor of production, and one could. I mean, a little bit. This sounds like kind of a Latin American fetish of not being dependent on other countries. Like, there's some factors you don't have, you trade for them, and they earn rents whether they're in Latin America or not, and we have efficient production.
So why does it matter whether I import engineers or not? I think it depends on from an adoption point of view, maybe it doesn't matter so much. I think if you're going to invent anything, I mean, if you ask the Mexicans whether they like to be Korea, both of them started manufacturing, assembling electronics products at the same time with the same level of patenting, and now Korea is like 8 times more. They were able to invent something new or develop something new, and they get the quasi-rents from that, right?
But Koreans who are not engineers are still well off.
Yes.
And so why wouldn't, if Mexico imported Korean engineers, why wouldn't the Mexicans who are not engineers be as well off as the Koreans who aren't engineers?
No, they would be. I guess if you were going to, I mean, if the Koreans invented the cell phone in Mexico, the rents are going to go to Korea.
Do you think the rents go to the country and not like the person who invented it, or the?
Yeah. Well, do you think the Korean is going to move permanently to Mexico? I mean, I don't know. I think that if Anaconda is bringing all its technologies down, but it's not developing new technologies there. Anything that's new is going to be developed in the U.S. and all the quasi rents will accrue to the. I don't know. That's kind of. Yeah. I don't know.
On exactly this point, and going back to this strange Worklanders Cucciarini paper, so one of the things that you find for France during its industrialization is that you have French entrepreneurs who learn about advanced British technology, but then they don't know how to operate it. So they actually import the British trained workers for the first couple of years to train their French workers. So in that sense, you have this migration of knowledgeable engineers. But you still need the entrepreneurs in France, which goes back to Noam's point on the complementarity.
Right. So maybe it's also that it's the learning by doing of the workers, for instance, that I'm capturing, and so those are your local workers.
Okay, one short question, and then we have to.
A comment about the subnational analysis of the U.S. would be, theoretically, be better to use something other than states, metropolitan areas or other agglomerations of counties, say, if you have the data. For some of those variables, like distance from the coast, there's and even rainfall are radically different within a state.
Sure.
You're using some kind of crude average.
But should I worry about like bleeding sort of effect? I mean, if I'm working at the county level and I have Williams College in my county, isn't the effect going to be much larger? I mean, how much of the impact of having an engineering school at Williams College is going to accrue to that particular county versus the surrounding area? I guess that's what I wonder.
It's an empirical question, but
Yeah.
I just say you're using extremely crude observations, which in modern urban and regional analysis are kind of a little bit passé.
I'm sure there's more questions, but unfortunately we have to cut it because to keep on our schedule. And Bill will be available definitely at coffee breaks to take the follow-up. Now we're going to move on to our next speaker, and our next timekeeper, though he's not an engineer, is vastly more skilled than I am.
Brown doesn't have a school of engineering, but Tufts does.